Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
Welcome, everyone, to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. Glad you could join me. Make sure that you visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com. Also, share this episode with your family and friends because there are so many issues in the United States, and our country is truly being challenged to its core. And one of the big issues is this Marxist movement that's been taking place for decades, but really it's now hit ahead. It's now here. We're seeing it every single day. And we have to stop this leftist attack, the assault on America's principles. And that's why I think of no better guest to bring on than former Congressman Louie Gohmert to the PAS report. Former Congressman, how are you today?
Well, as far as I know, I'm all right. Thank you very much, Nicholas.
Well, I'm glad you could join me today because this is something that you've been outspoken about. You've been at the forefront. You've been fighting this, whether you're in Congress, not in Congress. What do you see? First, let's start with how long has this threat been going on, and how did it gain so much steam within the last decade?
Well, actually, the communist movement goes back 100 years ago. There were people that were involved with the Soviet Union that wanted to see same kind of revolution here. But it was not until after World War II that it really picked up some steam, even though it was under the surface. And I tell you, I waited too many years, actually decades, to read Whittaker Chambers' book. He was the guy who was a communist in the early 50s, but got very concerned about what he was seeing. He was supporting the wrong side after all the years and all of the crimes that he was working to help commit with a guy named Alger Hiss. And anyway, his book, Witness, is one of the best books you could ever read. It's very long, but we've seen the same thing with David Horowitz, an atheist, a diehard communist. As he has said, my mama was a commie, my daddy was a commie, I was a commie, but he was a communist leader in the 60s and early 70s. And as he has mentioned many times, our slogan was the worse, the better. The more chaos we can create, the more we can degrade the moral fiber of America, the better it is for us having a revolution and taking over. But it's been in recent years, it seems that whether it was intentionally following Carlos the Jackal's advice or not, but he was the maybe most renowned international assassin. But years ago, he said, the only way to bring down the United States is for Marxists and radical Islamists to join forces. And we've actually seen that, Nicholas. And it's so amazing because Marxists, they hate religion, any religion, and they don't want anybody that is partaking or part of a religion of any kind, Christian, Muslim, whatever, that they don't want them part of the final government. On the other hand, you've got, the radical Islamists, they want a caliphate. They don't want atheists. They want to kill those people, get rid of them. And here you have these two groups working together to try to create enough chaos to through the Obama and the Biden administration, they've been able to accomplish so much in degrading our republic into close to an Orwellian state. But they have been highly successful. But I asked David Horowitz one time, I said, I never understood. You guys planned the protests and riots for the Democrat convention in '68. They were going to nominate the biggest liberal ever running from a major party for president. And he said, yeah, he had supported the Vietnam War, but from their standpoint, so they had reason to be upset. But I said, on the other side, you had the Republicans who were going to nominate Richard Nixon. He had been part of the anti-communist movement before he became vice president under Eisenhower. And he said, well, our thought was if Humphrey wins the presidency, it'll be much harder to get college students, young people out in the streets rioting, causing the chaos we needed. Whereas if Nixon got elected, we thought we'd have a lot better shot at getting the chaos we needed for the takeover of the revolution. And Nicholas, I think you're seeing that same mentality, not from the Democrats who have been too naive to realize in their arrogance, condemning those of us who cared about freedom, they don't see where this is ultimately going, where they think they're going to be in charge. And the mega wealthy that have been funding this, they think they're going to be part of that little veneer at the top that controls everything. But we know from history, the first thing Marxists do when they take up, or radical Islamists, they immediately kill the rich, take all the rich people's money, and then either kill them or send them to prison. They're not going to fare very well. And those people that have been useful idiots that helped them get the revolution they wanted, they'll be cast aside as the Orwellian totalitarian, some would say nirvana. Wow, we'll have a communist government. But that's where it's headed. And I'm hoping and praying that we're going to be able to prevent that from happening just by using the tools available, not including violence.
And I agree with that. I agree with your assessment. When you look at it, I forget who said it. They called it the watermelon concept. Green on the outside for the Islamic Revolution and red on the inside for the Communist Revolution. And I think that there are many. It creates this unholy alliance that we're seeing where, you know, the ends justify the means. So you'll create an alliance with groups that you're diametrically opposed to in order to bring down the bigger system. And that's what they're looking to do. And I think with the Democrats, for those that don't subscribe to Marxism, I think it's more narcissism where they think they can control this movement. But as you said,
right,
once the power transfers, that's it. They're going to be thrown overboard. They'll start with the conservatives, but then they'll quickly move to the centrists and Democrats as well. Unfortunately, what we're seeing on the state apparatus, right? So we've seen the state mobilize. You got a leading Republican presidential candidate that has 4 criminal prosecutions against him, the 2 federal, and then the 2 state. The New York City one, as of right now, it's in the jury. This is going to air Monday, so we should have an answer for whether they find Trump guilty or not guilty. But you're seeing all the levers of power being used to target political opposition, to silence voices, to censor people. How far has the left infiltrated the bureaucracy?
Oh, they basically, they haven't taken over all the positions in these bureaucracies, but the DOJ has been totally weaponized. And I think whoever the evil emperor is, they've been successful in luring Merrick Garland away from the things he stood for his whole life into being the Darth Vader if he will just finish his complete his turn to the dark side. But he has been on the dark side. He has not been about the constitutional protections. He's been vindictive. He's been vicious. He's used pretrial confinement as punishment unconstitutionally, and he could care less. He has been about intimidating political rivals or people or opponents. So that's that. They've been able to use people like that had a very meritorious life, but then they appeal to the dark side, and it's put our country in real jeopardy.
It certainly has. And you were in Congress, and this is one thing that frustrates me. You know, constitutionally, Congress has the
One
most
thing,
checks.
Just one thing, Nicholas?
Yes, the main thing. They have the most checks over the other two branches. And our founding fathers wanted that for a reason, because they felt that power should be in the hands of the many as opposed to the few. And they wanted the system as convoluted as possible so that
Right.
it actually makes it difficult to get things done. But Congress does have the power of oversight. Why is Congress so afraid to use that power of oversight to rein in this bureaucracy? What are they so afraid of?
Well, I saw the way it looked to me when Boehner was Speaker. He was afraid, and I think McCarthy and Ryan before him, they were afraid if they took too strong a position that it would help, the crazies on the other side. So they didn't want to take strong positions. Like with Boehner, Benghazi, we needed a real independent committee that was going to get to the bottom of that. But Boehner made clear first he didn't want a committee. And then second, it's what Boehner did repeatedly. He wanted committees to give good political theater and create good sound bites to use on TV and radio, but he didn't want to do anything. So he allowed a vote to hold Eric Holder in contempt, which he was, because he was hiding, suppressing, possibly destroying, we don't know, documents about Fast and Furious that were going to implicate a bunch of people in the federal government. And so we voted to hold him in contempt, but that can't stop there. Just like the Democrats did, they went after Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro for contempt of Congress because they weren't cooperating with this outrageously unlawful, unconstitutional, unruly committee. They didn't follow the rules. They didn't follow our history. They, turns out, apparently were destroying evidence. And this is not a committee, contempt for which should have ever justified a prosecution. But the Democrats go for the jugular. And so they pursued it. Boehner, Ryan, and McCarthy didn't have as long as the others, but when they had opportunities to stand up and make sure people were punished for their wrongdoing and that people could see consequences, they wouldn't allow it. They would stop it and threaten anybody, but usually they didn't have to threaten. It was more of a, look, as chairman of this committee, you need to be clear, we're not doing this. We're not. And the speaker had too much power. But Lois Lerner, you remember her, Nicholas?
I do.
I mean, she was clearly abusing the system to help the election of Barack Obama. And yet, even after she was caught, she had to take the Fifth Amendment before Congress. Her punishment was that she was put on vacation with pay. So she didn't have to work anymore. They just paid her for a long time while she didn't work. That was her punishment. Well, when other people in the IRS see that, they've got to think, well, I've got some people I'd like to punish. And if that's the way I get in trouble, I have to work. I mean, I have to get paid without working. Hey, not such a bad thing. So there haven't been consequences in all these years. People coming before Congress, whether Brennan, Clapper, they come before Congress and
openly lie to Congress.
Yeah. And I believe Christopher Wray is not an honest person when it comes to dealing with Republicans. I just don't find him to be honest. And my opinion is based on a lot of contact. But that's how we got where we are with regard to the utilizing the military. And by the way, the DOD, the Department of Defense, they've been subjugated to the Democratic Party's use as a tool. I don't know that you would have heard of him, but Adam Lovinger, I've tried to help for years, and we couldn't get help from administrations, and certainly not from the DOD. But his job at the Pentagon was to make sure that the Pentagon actually got value for the money they spent. And he found, imagine that idea. And so he found that there was $100, $200, $300,000 payments going to some professor in London, and maybe he'd written an article or something, but he didn't see that they were getting over $1 million worth of value from this guy. So he reported that, passed it up the chain. He was pretty high up. And as a result of catching that, they made up some garbage and fired him. Well, he's been trying to get his job back. He's a brilliant, honest, honorable person. But it turns out what he found were payments by the DOD going to a professor named Stephen Halper. And if that name rings a bell, it's because that's who was trying to set up Carter Page and Papadopoulos so that they could get a warrant to spy on the Trump campaign. So the DOD, it is in this deeper than people imagine. And Trump didn't get the kind of help from him that he should have. When I was in the Army, my first 2.5 years, Jimmy Carter was president. And we were constantly reminded that as upset as we were in the military at our commander-in-chief, you couldn't say it, you couldn't do anything to undermine him, or you would stand for a court-martial. So we had to be very careful what we said about our commander-in-chief. Well, under this
That's when we had standards.
Yeah, when Trump was president, look at Milley. I mean, he should have been prosecuted over and over, but there are no consequences when Republicans are in control, and that's got to change.
Well, I think that's the frustrating part, right? So you take someone like Milley, who was in charge of the training of Afghan security forces, right? I mean, he was doing that for years. You take someone like Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, who is in charge of Afghanistan operations for years. And it seems like government's like the one institution where you constantly and repeatedly fail, and yet you'll still get promoted. But at the same point, we're seeing it play out again in real time. You have FBI whistleblowers like Steve Friend and Garrett O'Boyle who have lost their jobs. And not only lost their jobs, I mean, the FBI forced Garrett O'Boyle to move, took his whole family, transplanted him to a new location. They won't fire them. They just suspended them without pay. And all we see is congressional hearings, as you said, this theater that goes on. At what point are Republicans in Congress going to realize that the bureaucracy is out of control and that it's dangerous? It's not only dangerous to the American people, but it's dangerous to them as well.
Well, I know Mike Johnson has seen these things and he believes it's got to be reined in. And I haven't been able to talk to him since he became speaker, but he's a good guy. And I just don't understand. I think he must be getting overwhelmed. You think about who you have to deal with, who you have to negotiate with, Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer, and Mitch McConnell, and whoever is making decisions for Biden. Mike doesn't have a whole lot of support, but we have this is such a critical time. We have got to do more standing up than has been happening. And I'm not for throwing him out at this point, but I am for pushing and encouraging to stand up. You do have some power.
Yeah, and I think Republicans need to utilize it. My fear is that you have literally half the Republican members of Congress that don't mind the big state apparatus. Did you find that when you were a member of Congress, that there were many Republicans who try and make it as if they're conservative, make it as if they're for limited government, but really they support the big government apparatus?
Yeah. Well, I think for most Republicans, when they get to Congress, they're not in favor of big government, but you get lulled into this sense of, oh, we need, you're awesome. You're going to help us save the country, but we need you to be a team player and work together and play together and whatnot. And you, I know you want this chairmanship, you want this A committee. We'll be able to get those. Maybe not this session, but we'll get those. But we just need you to be a team player till that happens. And they get lulled into this sense of, well, I need to be a team player. And some of them, I've seen it happen. They get to the end of their time and went, I was a team player, and we didn't accomplish any of the things that I promised and we promised we would do. It's really rather tragic.
It certainly is. And I think it's a disservice to those constituencies that put them into office. I mean, the reality is we need bold leadership at this point.
Right.
And when you look at it, you're someone that gets it. You see the threats that persist. Outside of Congress, what can ordinary people do?
Well, they can pay attention to what's happening and pay attention to the issues and make sure you're not just swayed by what your member of Congress puts out on social media or in an email telling you how great a conservative he is, but look beyond that and do some analysis yourself and find out what bills they voted for that cause you concern, so that if they vote to erode free speech or they vote to erode Second Amendment rights, then you're right there chomping at them. And let me tell you, Nicholas, there were times back when Boehner was Speaker, when he was pushing some stuff the Democrats wanted to do. And every now and then, people got so angry that they lit up their Congress members' phones and their email, and they had to go to Boehner and say, look, I know I told you I would vote for this bill, but man, I've never had this many thousands of people responding, email, calls. Our phone doesn't stop ringing. I'm not going to be able to vote with you on this like I said I would. I mean, I've seen that make a difference. It does not all the time. Sometimes Boehner was able to say, hey, just stay with me and we'll get you enough money in the next election. You can overcome this, but I need you to stay with me on this vote. But some of them, actually, by people raising Cain to their member of Congress over the phone and emails, and you don't need to cuss and you don't need to threaten their lives. Just make sure they know you're going to have a massive neighborhood group that's out there trying to keep them from being reelected. And it makes a difference. We won some things we could never have won if people hadn't spoken up.
It does. And people do need to realize that we actually do have power in this system. I mean, that's the way the founding fathers intended it. If we exert it, we can make and foster changes within the system. However, and you talk about David Horowitz's book, America Betrayed. What we see is that we have an education system that didn't educate American people on what America is all about, what our principles are, the founding of this country, the history of this country, the American identity. And I fear that so many have no idea what the American identity actually is. And you can't defend what you don't know. You can't fight for what you don't know. Do you think that that's possibly the biggest reason why we're witnessing this cultural rot that we're seeing today?
I think it is. The people like Bill Ayers and others that were blowing up buildings and rioting and doing all that stuff, they found out they really didn't accomplish much by that. So what do? They end up in the universities becoming tenured professors, teaching teachers that are going to teach the young children. And they teach them that this Marxism stuff is really a good idea, but we'll call it progressivism. It's not progress. It's exactly the opposite of progress. I guess that's, you get progress, so you got Congress, but as the antonym. But anyway, you go back to their teaching, and then those generations of teachers teaching, and you get where we are, Nicholas, where young people do not know the truth. In David's book, he points out how outrageous and scandalous the propagandists at the New York Times editorial board were when they said our history did not begin with 1776. It began in 1619. As David points out, they say that's when 20 slaves came over, which was a lie. There were 20 Africans who were indentured servants, and they joined a whole bunch of white indentured servants who were supposed to be able to work off their indentured nature within 5 to 7 years. That was not where we were in 1776, when even Jefferson, if you go back, and I'm sure you have, look at the original draft that Jefferson did, it's like the biggest paragraph grievance against King George was about him ever allowing this horrible thing called slavery to get started because it would cripple a country. And that was a grievance. Well, that part got taken out when votes were had in the Continental Congress, but still they recognize, and people love to say, well, Washington had slaves. We should, there were laws in place that made it difficult, if not impossible, to free slaves in Virginia. And Washington did free the slaves he could when in his will on his death. But not all, but most of these guys understood slavery is crippling in our country. And Christians, many of them understood. They were the ones white Christians leading the charge to eliminate slavery. And it ended up in a civil war where more people were killed than all the other wars we fought in put together. And there's no other nation in history that has fought for the freedom in a war of people of a different color and to end slavery. This was unheard of, but it was because of the Judeo-Christian foundation we had in this country.
Absolutely. And people don't realize, but there were a lot of founding fathers that were outspoken critics of slavery, and it was heavily debated at the Constitutional Convention with Governor Morris and Elbridge Gerry and a whole bunch of others. Alexander Hamilton was against it. And so our history is much more complicated than the New York Times likes to allow. But Congressman, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to the audience today. You have an open invitation to come back anytime. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Nicholas.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.